Thanks for joining me as I present the history of the Mittleider method, the man and his legacy. This is Jim Kennard, president of the Food for Everyone Foundation. In the late 70s, Jacob R. Mittleider's book, More Food from Your Garden, which is now called Mittleider Growbox Gardens, became very popular, and my family used it to create an extremely productive container or grow box garden on a sunny 20 by 30 foot part of our yard. And we practically lived out of the garden for 6 months that year. We were sold on this amazing system of growing. In 1978, Jacob Mittleider moved from Loma Linda, California to Salt Lake City, Utah, and because we only lived a mile apart, we soon became acquainted. Our family continued to grow great gardens every year, and in 1989 I acquired a 3/4 acre parcel of land adjacent to Utah's Hogle Zoo. I created a large Mittleider soil bed garden on a half-acre of ground, installed the recommended automated watering system, and then asked Dr. Mittleider if I could put his name on the garden. Because 700,000 visitors to the zoo each year saw the garden, and I wanted to promote his methods. Jacob gave me permission to advertise his name so long as I maintained the garden according to his standards. So we became much better friends, as he would occasionally come to the garden and work with me and invite me to his home to work in his garden and learn from him. In order for you to understand and appreciate the uniqueness and importance of the Jacob R. Mittleider system of family gardening, you need to learn what influences and experience shaped his life, created his unique skills, motivations, and passions, and made it possible for him to do what no one else has ever done with family food production around the world. Let me take you now on a visual journey as we look at the history of the Mittleider method. Jacob was born and raised on a farm in southeastern Idaho by faithful Seventh-day Adventists, and he remained a devout follower of that faith throughout his life. He did not like farming and vowed he would never be a farmer. So, he attended high school at the Gem State Academy near Boise, Idaho, and learned the profession of baking. He married, moved to California, and became a baker. But in 1943, Jacob lost his job as a baker because he had a short temper and got into an argument with the manager of the store, and he walked out. Then he had to learn another profession. The only other thing he knew was what he learned as a boy on the farm. He didn't want to farm, but he was desperate because by this time he had a wife and 2 daughters. So he started learning how to grow flowers. He learned fast. He picked the brains of the best growers in the Imperial Valley of Southern California and hired the best soil lab on the West Coast, called the Matkin Labs, and put them on retainer. He managed to learn how to grow flowers and became highly successful, and probably fairly wealthy. Retail nurseries ordered his plants from as far away as Louisiana, and he even had a contract with Sears to ship 5-ounce containers of 9 plants, which he called magic mitts, by flying tiger lines to Sears stores all over the country. Something happened, though, before he was able to get that contract into operation. Because of ulcers, the doctors removed half of his stomach. He had been working 18 to 19 hours a day and living on 4 or 5 hours of sleep. The doctor told him he was not going to live long unless he made some major changes in his life. Jacob made those changes. He got rid of the business and decided to devote whatever time the Lord would give him to helping others, giving back, and teaching and blessing the lives of people around the world. He was 43 years old at that time, and the Lord gave him another 43 years of life in which he devoted himself almost exclusively to blessing mankind. He started in Oregon by creating a big garden at the Adventist Milo Academy there, and he grew in this greenhouse you can see in the background during the following winter. He grew corn, all kinds of vegetables, potatoes, and all the greens. This was an amazing project. We still know growers today that were students of Jacob Mittleider back in those early days in Oregon. As a matter of fact, you may have heard me talk about the amazing commercial tomato operation of Victoria Roth in Bend, Oregon. She worked as a young girl with Jacob Mittleider at the Milo Academy. About this time, Jacob went to the people at the Adventist Loma Linda University and told them that he thought it was senseless for people to be starving around the world when the God he worshiped would not create an earth that could not feed the people. They basically told him to put his money where his mouth was. He visited 24 countries over the course of 6 months and came back more sure than ever that there was no excuse for people starving. He said, "They have land, sunlight, and water, and they waste all three." So the folks at Loma Linda sent him to one of the toughest places on planet Earth, a place called Papua New Guinea, where they were cannibals. The villagers would fight with each other, and the winners would eat the losers. It got so bad that as many as 90% of the people in the villages that were surviving the wars were dying of a terrible disease called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. We know it today as mad cow disease, and it is caused by cannibalism. The problem today and in the recent past is that our animal growers have been taking diseased and old and useless animals, grinding them up, and putting them into the feed of the next generation of cows. There was such a terrible outbreak of mad cow disease in Britain recently that the world put a blockade on all British meat for 2 or 3 years to try and stop it. Pray you never get mad cow disease, because it will kill you in a most horrible way. This was one of Jacob's first experiences with the dangers of using animal byproducts, and he had many other experiences that taught him the same lesson. By the time he got there, these people had stopped eating each other. At the point of a gun, the Australian military had stopped them. Here's what they were trying to live on. This was a row of sweet potatoes. Pathetic. At the high elevation hospital, it took 22 months for them to harvest 1.5 tons per acre of sweet potatoes on this ground. Between nutrient deficiencies, diseases, and horrific weeds, these people were really struggling to feed themselves. As a matter of fact, the Adventist hospital and school on that island nation were about to be closed down because they couldn't grow enough food for their students. This is what their crops looked like. Here's their cabbage with terrible deficiencies. Such a waste. Their sweet potatoes were skinny, and there wasn't much nutrition in them. The school had to provide 5 pounds of sweet potatoes per student each day for them to have enough nutrition to stay reasonably healthy. By the way, as Jacob visited all those countries around the world, he would see people who were sick and starving, and they would often have doctors and bush hospitals to take care of the people, but everywhere he went, he never saw anyone taking care of the plants. There were no plant doctors, and he determined that that's what he was going to do. See these men? They had changed from being fierce, scary-looking warriors to becoming gentlemen and educated and good. But they were still living on those pathetic sweet potatoes. Here's a different location, but with the same problem. Here the garden doctor enters the scene, and he changes all that. He eliminates the weeds, he makes the garden a thing of beauty, and he starts to feed the plants. He starts by growing healthy seedlings. Those propagated sweet potato seedlings are fed a complete, natural mineral nutrient mix that gives the plants everything they need. Voila! Now you see beautiful, green, large, healthy plants. A magnificent, productive garden. Now the same men grow sweet potatoes so big they can only hold 1 or 2 in their arms. Here is Jacob Mittleider's wife Mildred and a boy and girl holding monster-sized sweet potatoes. The boy's named Silas. He was Jacob's yard boy. Silas went on to finish school. He worked hard, got a career, and today he is known as His Excellency, Sir Silas Atapare, President or Governor General of Papua New Guinea. That's not all that happened. Back in those days, there were hardly any Christians on the island nation. Today, over 10% of the population are Seventh-day Adventists. 25% of their parliament are Adventists. And people say the Adventists own Papua New Guinea. In a good way. They've educated the people, given them health and longevity. These are wonderful, amazing things, all because of the gardening Jacob Mittleider introduced, and, of course, the labor and great work of many devoted Seventh-day Adventists who ran the school and the hospital. Here's the island of Fiji, where Jacob went next, and the pictures look the same, just pathetic plants and weeds everywhere. When Mittleider got hold of it, this is what the garden looked like, with tapioca growing neck-high. It was an amazing transformation. Here is some taro or dallow. This is a root plant that people in the tropics live on. They're supposed to be 8 to 10 pounds each. These are about 8 ounces each, and they were afflicted with scab disease. Jacob taught the people how to correct that terrible problem by taking tiny cuttings and putting those cuttings into a clean, soilless medium, growing them, and feeding them proper mineral nutrients. This is the result on Fiji after Dr. Mittleider grew clean plants in a healthy medium with proper nutrition. There were tremendous changes, and those who paid attention, many of them became wealthy growers, because Jacob showed them how. Next, he went to Okinawa. This is an island that is now a part of Japan. The big city of Naha has more than 1 million people in it. They have no normal place to grow, only a flat roof, patio, or a driveway. Look at the forefront of the picture. You'll see something that looks like a box. Here you can see the start of what we call a grow box garden. That garden became a thing of beauty and productivity right in the middle of the city on a big parking lot. Another problem the people of Okinawa have is steep mountainsides and a lot of cyclones. As many as 86 cyclones a year whistled down through those steep hillsides. The people couldn't grow anything. Jacob hired a bulldozer and bulldozed those mountains and terraced them. He installed grow boxes, as he called them, or containers with open bottoms, and filled them with a simple mixture of sawdust and sand. Here you can see the result of Jacob Mittleider's grow box gardens in Okinawa. Notice in the background you'll see a vertical structure like a fence, which is a windbreak. They were testing different things to see what would reduce the wind so they could grow in spite of the cyclones that came roaring through. He did such amazing things that General Lampert, the ruling authority, and other dignitaries, including the Japanese ambassador, came and saw what Dr. Mittleider was doing and gave him great high praise. Since that time, the people of Okinawa, with his help, have learned to grow in greenhouses, have learned to grow on their steep mountainsides, and have learned to grow even in their cities in boxes on whatever they have, their flat roofs, their patios, and their driveways. Everywhere Jacob went, he taught adult students who studied and worked with him for several months. By this time, he had created an excellent course of study, and with the collaboration of Dr. Andrew Nelson, a highly respected educator, Jacob authored the college-level agronomy textbook, Food for Everyone, which is still used in several locations around the world today. Jacob next conducted projects in 4 countries in Africa. The large rock outcropping is called a kopje. Around the edges of the kopje, sand accumulates as wind and weather wear away the stone. And of course, leaves fall from the trees and mix with the sand. When Jacob couldn't find sawdust or typical regular sand, he used kopje soil to grow his seedlings. It was clean, and it did not have weeds, bugs, or diseases. Clean forest mulch in this country can be used the same way. He established a gardening training project at a school called Solusi in Zimbabwe, and this is the way he grew at this location. Because of the dry climate, it's a little different growing procedure than he employed in Papua New Guinea. These were 5-foot wide soil beds, level with ridges to hold the water, and he filled them with seedlings. Let's see what Jacob did in Zimbabwe. Again, he started by teaching them how to grow their own seedlings. That is always the best procedure, to teach people to grow their own seedlings so they are not dependent on the grid or other outside influences, and they can grow healthy seedlings fast when they need them. Look at the garden in the background. What an amazing garden that turned out to be. Here you see a man watering the garden. The hose was a luxury. In the students' home gardens, they hauled buckets of water, sometimes long distances. In addition to the wide beds, they had narrow beds, and they grew vining and climbing plants vertically in those narrow beds. In this picture, you can see cucumber vines, and they're 7 feet tall. If you look closely, you can see cucumbers in there. Those cucumber vines were grown in one row, 6 inches apart. Isn't that amazing? Of course, Jacob taught his students how to do some very important pruning. Otherwise, it would be a big mess. Here you see tomato plants that were grown vertically in one row, 8 inches apart. Such tremendous yield. Nothing like that had ever been seen before. Here you see a book called Let's Grow Tomatoes. Remember that Jacob started out as a baker. He did everything according to the recipe. He documented everything he did, and he was always experimenting and trying to improve. When he made improvements, he documented them. And when he wasn't out in the world blessing people's lives directly, he was home in his little place in Salt Lake City writing books. He wrote Let's Grow Tomatoes while living there, and it's a great book. It teaches and demonstrates how to grow tomatoes and other vertically grown crops. This picture shows almost solid plants. The aisles are so narrow you can hardly walk down them, and he is just growing brassicas and greens here. If he were growing larger plants, he would have no room to walk at all. Jacob learned from this to have wider aisles. These are some of the success stories Jacob created in all 4 countries in which he conducted projects in Africa. Everywhere in Africa, they had to fence their gardens to keep the marauding animals out. The people are so happy to have healthy food. As I said earlier, when Jacob first started going around the world, remember he went to 24 countries, he came back and said they had doctors for the people, but no doctors for the plants. Jacob became the plant doctor, and he literally changed millions of lives. One of the students from the classes that Dr. Mittleider taught in 4 countries in Africa over the course of 2 years was Kenneth. This was Kenneth's garden before he came to the Mittleider class. And this is Kenneth's garden as a Mittleider grower. It was like day and night. As a matter of fact, Kenneth, before his Mittleider training, would be lucky to see $20 per year in cash. It was a barter economy. You grow your own, then trade with your neighbors. Everybody was struggling. You did the best you could. In just 6 months after Kenneth went home from the class, he grew and sold $575 in cash crops, and he still was in the middle of his growing season when Mittleider visited him. So this changed the world for Kenneth. Have a look at these tomatoes. They are so pathetic, diseased, and hardly alive. Good luck trying to live on those. Now look at what's close by. This is Lawrence. The previous tomatoes belonged to Lawrence's father, growing tomatoes according to the method they'd always used, which was the best of organic they could get, manure and compost. His father's tomatoes were disease-ridden and basically dying after 3 weeks of meager harvest. Lawrence grew his tomatoes until they were 7 feet high, and then they started coming back down and grew back to the ground. They grew for basically a whole year with no disease. Why? Because the plants were healthy, well-fed, and naturally disease-resistant. That's it with humans, too. If you have a healthy diet, especially if you have a whole foods, plant-based diet, you and your body will resist disease, and you will stay healthy like these gardens did. This is Tanzania, a neighboring country to Zimbabwe, and Jacob did the same thing in Tanzania, with magnificent gardens everywhere he worked. This is Jerry. He had a little better garden before using the Mittleider method, but it was still pretty pathetic. This is Jerry's garden after the Mittleider training program in Tanzania. It is still early in the growing season. The plants are still relatively small, but beautiful, uniform, healthy, and growing like crazy. Jacob always taught the people how to grow by feeding their plants accurately with a balanced nutrient mix that included all 13 nutrients the plants need that man and the ground can supply. Mittleider next went to Hope, British Columbia, Canada. You see the mountain rising up immediately right behind this place? This was a difficult place to grow, and the people were having a hard time. This was another Adventist school, and Jacob immediately turned it into a gardening mecca with tons and tons of good, healthy food for these students. Understand that so many of the students are strictly vegetarian, and so they were dependent on this garden for their food. Jacob did an amazing job there. Once again, he taught them how to grow healthy seedlings. This gives you a big 4 to 6 week head start. You don't lose plants to cold soil or diseases or bugs. You have 100% healthy plants going into your garden, and they grow fast so that they're in the garden a shorter time, and you get them out and harvested before diseases or bugs can hurt them. He also taught them how to grow inside a greenhouse, and he was growing these tomatoes to maturity right there in the greenhouse. Milo, Oregon was where he did his first greenhouse project, and he learned a lot about growing vegetables in a greenhouse even in the winter. He also introduced something different in Hope, BC. He grew in narrow, raised beds in the soil with great success, and this is what we mostly use today. Jacob determined that this was the best of all worlds, 18-inch wide soil beds that were raised and level with ridges. And you see the students transplanting into those beds here. Look at the tomatoes growing. In this case, he was using stakes instead of baling twine strings and T-frames that we recommend today. The next country we'll talk about is Trinidad. By the way, Dr. Mittleider visited 27 countries over 37 years. He conducted 75 major gardening projects like I'm describing. He changed the course of history in some of those countries and blessed the lives of millions of people. The island of Trinidad is just off the coast of South America. They have this massive lake of asphalt, and it provides money for the government. By the time Jacob was asked to come there, people were really struggling, and they were importing food because they couldn't grow food in this terrible caliche soil. It is hard, miserable, very cloddy, with very little nutrition in it. This is, of course, close to sea level, and I think it was actually a coral-based soil. That's why it's kind of orange and pink. Look at what Jacob did. First, he taught them to grow healthy seedlings. Notice the seedlings are off the ground and on tables. That is always critical, so you get away from the diseases, the pests, and all of those problems. And then, voila! Again, using one of my favorite French words, magnificent gardens. He introduced something here that we've seen previously. We have what is called a T-frame with arched PVC pipe on it and covered with greenhouse plastic. It was used in Trinidad with great success, and we used it in Papua and Colombia to protect the plants from driving torrential rains. In some places, like Arizona, Texas, and Mexico, it is used with shade cloth to protect plants from temperatures above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. This is a great thing for you to have in your garden. Here is a picture of an in-the-garden greenhouse that has the plastic coming all the way down the sides and the ends. This will allow you, in temperate and cooler climates, to grow your tomatoes and other vining warm weather crops until November and even December. There are many benefits of the T-frame with the arched PVC over the top and covered with greenhouse plastic, which was first introduced in Trinidad and Tobago 30 years ago. Notice the plants here. They're beautiful, close together, with uniform growth. Dr. Mittleider documented many years of learning in this amazing 250-page book with hundreds of pictures like you've just seen. I love that book. That was the book I used to create my half-acre garden at Utah's Hogle Zoo, and I had that garden for almost 20 years. I wore out more than one grow bed gardening book because I always had it in the garden with me. Jacob was next invited to go to communist Russia. Back in 1989, Mr. Gorbachev created something called glasnost and perestroika, which basically opened up Russia to the rest of the world. They allowed the Adventists to open a small college if Jacob would create an agriculture program. He did. They gave him this little dacha, and he turned a mess very quickly into a beautiful and productive garden. The communist agricultural agents would come into his garden and steal his plants. They would stick them under their jackets and take them back to their labs. This went on for several weeks, and finally they approached him and said, "You've got to tell us what you're doing here. We have never seen such beautiful, green, healthy plants." He was then able to teach them proper nutrition, proper feeding of plants, and they ended up sending students from their most prestigious ag school, the Timirazi Academy, to his 3-month program. We would hear those students, after they graduated from the 3-month class, say, "I learned more about growing food in 3 months than I did in 5 years at the academy." These are just a few of the things Jacob did in Russia. In the 2.5 years between the time when Jacob Mittleider got there and when communism fell in August of 91, Jacob and his student graduates were able to help millions of people learn how to grow food. You see, Stalin killed 13 million of his people, collectivized the farms, and put the people into factories, and Russia became an importing country because they couldn't grow enough food for themselves. I believe that by the time communism was overthrown, Jacob had taught enough people to grow food that they had the courage not to go back to communism. In 1993, I was in Moscow on the day when communists tried to take over the government again, and it did not happen. You see the first Sayoksky Russia greenhouse in this picture. This is a typical Mittleider greenhouse with what is called a continuous ventilator across the top. We build this way all over the world because people don't have electricity and fans, and that section at the top opens up, so the warm air goes out and cools the greenhouse naturally. The sides also roll up, so between the sides rolling up and the top venting the heat, this is a great greenhouse. Jacob Mittleider's agriculture program in Russia ended up with 117 acres, all given to him by the communists. Over the course of the last 26 years, they have taught over 1,000 students. And I believe there are tens of millions of people whose lives have been impacted directly by this gardening method in the Russian Commonwealth countries. I have been told by graduates that some of them have gone on to have as many as 50,000 people in their influence growing Mittleider gardens. They've told me that the Mittleider method is the most popular and productive method of growing in many regions of the Commonwealth countries of Russia. Talk about changing people's lives. I believe this humble man did more than giant armies could do in doing good. I bless him every day for the opportunity I have of following in his footsteps in a small way. To give you more of an idea of the dramatic changes Jacob brought to Russia, in this picture you see zucchini on the left and beans on the right. When Jacob arrived in 1989, most people there were growing just 4 things. They had food under communism, but it consisted of borscht. And their borscht had cabbage and beets and potatoes, and if they were lucky, they might get a carrot or turnip. The first year Jacob was there, he grew 16 different vegetables. And by the time he stopped going over there during the growing season 7 years later, they were growing 23 major types of vegetables in Zaoksky, Russia. Understand, this is at 54 degrees north latitude. That's the same latitude as northern Canada, almost the southern tip of Alaska. Here's another book called Gardening by the Foot, which Dr. Mittleider wrote about that time. It's also an excellent book with hundreds of pictures and illustrations on growing in containers. The cover picture is of a Russian garden. He also wrote a 3-volume set called The Garden Doctor. This is an absolute treasure that teaches and illustrates nutrient deficiencies for all 13 nutrients that plants require. This, plus the gardens he created and the students he taught, convinced the Russian Communist government to honor an American, probably the first ever, for his work in agriculture. They made him the featured speaker at the Yalta Conference of Agriculture Ministers, and they praised his name. The government agriculture minister on national television said, "The only food grown in Russia that's fit to eat is grown in a Mittleider garden." It's no wonder that Zaoksky graduates were able to spread the work so fast. They would announce a Mittleider gardening seminar, and they would have 1,500 to 2,500 people show up for the day. As a matter of fact, Jacob almost died from a brain aneurysm over there during the winter of 1991. Normally, if an American got sick, he was as good as dead. The communists could not admit that their medical system was inferior to the West's, so they would tuck him away somewhere and let him die. Not with Jacob Mittleider. I was told Mr. Gorbachev sent his personal limousine to get Jacob out of the country, and that they had a couple hundred college students clearing the runway because it was such a terrible stormy night. They got him out, and the doctors at Loma Linda University in California saved his life. He ended up living for more than 15 years after that. That was pretty good thanks back to him and to the world that the communists gave, wasn't it? By 1998, I had been with Dr. Mittleider to Russia for a month and had helped him on another major project in Utah. I then retired from other full-time pursuits and determined to devote myself to carrying on Dr. Mittleider's work. We've created a website, digitized all of the books and training materials, and conducted numerous months-long humanitarian training projects in countries including Turkey, Armenia, Georgia, Madagascar, and Colombia. We also conduct free group gardening seminars around the United States. In 2004, I was invited to go to Armenia by a retired agriculture professor to help him with an ambitious gardening training project. My translator was a young woman named Araxia, and this is Araxia's mother, Tamara. At that time, Tamara knew nothing about gardening, nothing. She was a city girl, born and bred, and had never grown a garden. I was there that spring, and she saw some of the things we were doing. After that, we created a large garden, a training facility, and a greenhouse, and Tamara has become our representative in Armenia. By the way, that's a 20-pound cabbage. She's also grown many other things, including potatoes. The potatoes on the right are purple potatoes, and Tamara did not grow those from other potatoes. The normal way in America and most places around the world is to propagate them by cutting up potatoes and planting those. Tamara used actual seed. We taught her how to use true potato seeds, and she grew a fabulous crop of wonderful purple potatoes. The seeds came from Peru, by the way. That was several years ago, and she is still able to use those as seed potatoes. A few years ago, we also started and conducted a school of agronomy in the capital city of Antananarivo, Madagascar. A short video of that great experience can be seen at the link below this video. More recently, we were invited to go to a place called Popayan, Colombia, in South America, by a world-famous doctor named Dr. Alfonso Tenorio. He was lecturing around the world, teaching the truth that people were dying from tuberculosis, malaria, HIV, and leprosy unnecessarily because they were weak from poor nutrition. When he discovered the Mittleider method of growing, he got us to come to Colombia, and we taught on the University del Cauca campus for 4 months. He was thrilled with the kind of gardens that we created there. That particular state of the Colombian nation, called Cauca, was the poorest state for children's nutrition in the entire country. We were there to show those people how they could turn that around and get good nutrition into their children. The university agriculture professors proved to themselves the tremendous difference proper feeding makes by comparing the Mittleider weekly feed with 16-16-16 and an organic mix they were using and teaching. The garden doctor's work goes on, and it is corroborated today by the best doctors in the world, who say and who prove that healthy food makes healthy people, and healthy plants are the best source of good food for human beings. The 10 digitized Mittleider gardening books, along with 9 subject-specific gardening manuals, which are individually searchable, have been compiled on one CD known as the Mittleider Gardening Library. And this shows you what you can do in your own backyard. This garden is in southeastern Idaho, and they wanted to try the boxes. They have a fabulous garden, as you can see. They grow virtually everything, and they feed their family out of that small garden. They were using 2x2s as frames for their vertical crops, and we have substantially improved that with T-frames now. The Mittleider Gardening Course Book was the last book Jacob Mittleider wrote before his death in May of 2006. The Foundation continues to conduct gardening training projects, make improvements to the method, and document our findings with updates to this book. This book is the recipe for a great garden in any soil, in any climate. Thank you for joining me.